There are monsters that don't hide under the bed. They sit at the dinner table, say grace before meals, and call themselves family. The story I'm about to share with you is, without doubt, one of the most difficult you'll ever hear. My name is Abigail Miller Johnson, though most folks around here just call me Abby. I'm 82 years old now, with more than half a century of silence weighing on my shoulders. I was born and raised in a small town in rural Kentucky, where the pine-covered hills whisper secrets and family matters stay buried deeper than the coal in the mines. Most people around here know me as the white-haired lady who sells homemade apple pies at the church bake sale and never misses Sunday service. Few can imagine what I've carried inside me since I was 10 years old. Sharing this story moves me deeply, so I'd appreciate if you'd hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to show your support. I'd also love to connect with you in the comments. Please let me know which part of America or the world you're watching from. My childhood home was a simple two-story farmhouse painted white, with blue trim, with a wraparound porch, where my mother kept rocking chairs and pots of geraniums. We were a modest family, like most in our region. My father, Richard, everyone called him Rick, worked hard at the lumber mill, leaving before sunrise and returning after sunset, his flannel shirt carrying the sweet smell of pine sawdust. My mother, Charlotte, managed the house and us children, while also baking bread to sell to neighbors and running a small veggie garden that helped put food on our table. I was the oldest of 3 children. After me came Samuel, whom we called Sammy, 2 years my junior, and little Grace, who had just turned 5. Our life was simple, but marked by small joys. The smell of fresh bread cooling on the windowsill, mother's stories by the fireplace on winter evenings, swimming in the creek during hot summer days. We were poor by most standards, but happy in our own way, until tragedy knocked on our door. On that fateful May 12, 1957, the day began gray and drizzly, with a steady rain that showed no sign of stopping. I woke earlier than usual to the sound of my mother coughing in the next room. Not her usual morning cough, but something deep and ragged, as if something inside her was tearing. When I entered my parents' bedroom, I found Mom lying in bed, her face flushed with fever, her lips tinged with a strange bluish color that I didn't recognize then, but now know was cyanosis. "Mom, are you okay?" I asked, frightened by how she looked. She tried to smile, but the effort seemed to cost her greatly. "Just a bad cold, honey. It'll pass." But it didn't pass. Throughout the morning, her condition deteriorated rapidly. The fever climbed higher, her breathing became more labored. Dad, who normally would have been at the mill by that hour, hadn't left because of the heavy rain. When he saw her state, his face hardened with worry. "I'm taking Charlotte to the hospital in Lexington," he said, referring to the nearest city with a proper hospital, about 40 miles away. "Abby, you're in charge of the little ones until I get back." At that time, my paternal grandfather, Henry Miller, was living with us. He'd moved in after my grandmother passed away, about 8 months earlier. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, even at 68, with calloused hands from decades working as a foreman at various lumber operations. He had a neatly trimmed gray mustache and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything around him with cold calculation. "I'll look after the children, Richard," my grandfather said, placing a hand on my father's shoulder. "You take Charlotte, and don't worry about things here." Dad nodded gratefully, wrapped Mom in several blankets, and carried her to our old Chevy pickup. The last image I have of her is her pale face against the dark blankets, her eyes meeting mine one final time, as Dad carried her out into the relentless rain. "Take care of your brother and sister, Abby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll be back soon." Words that would become an impossible promise to keep. The day dragged on endlessly. I tried to maintain a normal routine for my siblings, preparing a simple meal as Mom had taught me, and inventing games to distract them. My grandfather remained on the porch most of the time, smoking his pipe and watching the rain that showed no sign of letting up. Occasionally he'd come in to check on us, but soon returned to his silent vigil. As the day grew darker, my worry increased. Where was Dad? Why weren't they back yet? Had the rain made the roads impassable? Around 7 p.m., I put my siblings to bed. Sammy, understanding that something serious was happening, took a long time to fall asleep. Grace, too young to comprehend, fell asleep quickly after I told her one of the stories Mom used to tell. It was almost 9 when I heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. I ran to the window, my heart racing with hope of seeing Mom coming home, but it was only Dad, alone, drenched by the rain that was now coming down in sheets. When he entered, I knew immediately that something terrible had happened. His eyes were red and swollen, his normally straight posture now slumped like that of a much older man. He removed his soaked hat and held it against his chest, as if standing before a coffin. "Where's Mom?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the devastated look on his face. "Your mother," he began, but his voice failed. He swallowed hard before continuing. "Charlotte didn't make it, honey. It was pneumonia, too far gone." The doctor said nothing could be done. The world seemed to collapse around me. How could this be? Mom had been there just that morning, trying to smile despite the fever. How could she be gone forever in just one day? Dad hugged me tight, his wet clothes soaking my dress, but I barely noticed. We stood like that for a long time, sharing a grief that words couldn't express. My grandfather watched from the kitchen doorway, his face impassive as always. "The arrangements for the wake are already being made," Dad finally said, pulling away slightly. "I'll bring her home tomorrow morning. I'm going to need you to be strong, Abby, for the little ones." I nodded, swallowing my tears. I'd always been the responsible daughter, the one who helped Mom with everything. Now I needed to do even more. "Get some rest, son," my grandfather said to my father. "The journey was long, and tomorrow will be difficult. I'll keep an eye on the children with Abby." Dad looked at me hesitantly, but exhaustion was evident in every line of his face. "Try to get some sleep, honey. I know it's hard, but you'll need your strength." I nodded again, though I knew sleep would be impossible that night. Dad went to his room, the one he had shared with Mom until just hours ago. The muffled sound of his sobbing penetrated the thin walls of our house for hours. I stayed in the living room, sitting at the table, staring at nothing. The rain continued outside, as if the sky itself was crying for my mother. My grandfather sat at the other end of the table, pouring himself a glass of bourbon that we kept for visitors. "Have a drink," he said, extending the glass to me. "It helps numb the pain." I hesitated. I'd never had alcohol in my life, and I knew Mom wouldn't approve. But Mom wasn't there anymore, and the pain in my chest felt like it would swallow me whole. I accepted the glass and took a small sip. The liquor burned my throat, making my already teary eyes water even more. I took another sip, larger this time. "That's it," my grandfather murmured, refilling the glass when I'd finished. "Life is hard, Abby. Better learn that early." I don't know how many glasses I drank that night. I only know that the world began to blur, my thoughts becoming confused. At some point, my grandfather got up from his chair and came to my side. "Come on, I'll help you to bed," he said, his voice strangely soft as he helped me stand. But he didn't take me to the room I shared with Grace. Instead, he led me to his own room at the back of the house. In my confusion and grief, I didn't question this. Perhaps I thought it was better not to disturb my little sister with my crying. What happened next remained buried in the darkest corner of my memory for many years. Just fragment rough hands where they shouldn't be, sharp pain, ignored pleas, the weight of a large body on mine, too small to resist. The smell of bourbon and pipe tobacco mingled with hot breath on my face. Words whispered that still haunt my nightmares. "You're the woman of the house now." I must have passed out at some point because my next clear memory is of dawn. I was back in my own bed, lying next to Grace, who slept peacefully, unaware of the new reality surrounding us. For a moment, I thought everything, Mom's illness, her death, what happened after, had been just a cruel nightmare. Then I felt the physical pain, saw the bruises on my arms, noticed the bloodstain on the sheet. It hadn't been a nightmare. It was all real. My mother was truly dead. And on the same day I lost her, I also lost my innocence, my childhood, my trust in the world. In that moment, something inside me shut down. An iron door descended over my emotions, locking everything in. I got up carefully so as not to wake Grace, changed my clothes, washed my face in the basin we kept in the room. I looked in the small mirror on the wall and saw a different person, still with the face of a 10-year-old girl, but with eyes that had aged decades in a single night. I went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, just as Mom would. It was the day of her wake, and I knew the house would soon be filled with neighbors and relatives. Normalcy was my only refuge, the only thing preventing me from completely falling apart. Dad was already up, his eyes swollen, his face marked by a night of tears. He hugged me again, and I needed all my newly discovered strength, not to dissolve in his embrace, not to scream the truth about what had happened. "I'm going to get your mother now," he said, his voice hoarse. "Look after the little ones when they wake up." I nodded mechanically. Looking after the little ones was what I would do from that day forward. Looking after the little ones, and keeping silent. Because who would believe me? Who would take the word of a child over that of a respected man like my grandfather? And how could I bring more pain to my father, who had just lost the love of his life? So began my long winter of silence. The day I lost my mother, and so much more. The day I learned, in the cruelest way possible, that the world isn't a safe place, especially for a little girl. The day I learned that sometimes monsters share our own blood. And I remained silent for so long that I almost forgot what it was like to have a voice, until something happened that changed everything. But that's a story for our next encounter. The days following my mother's burial passed like a thick fog over the Kentucky hills in winter. The wake was a blur of familiar faces, hugs that failed to warm me, and words of comfort that didn't reach my ears. I remember only the simple pine casket, Mom's face too serene, like a wax figure, not the vibrant woman who sang while kneading bread dough, and how I firmly held my siblings' hands throughout. Sammy, at 8 years old, understood enough to cry nonstop. Grace, too young to comprehend finality, repeatedly asked when Mommy would wake up. Each question was a knife twisting in my chest. In our small rural community, mourning had its own rituals. The women took over our kitchen, filling our pantry with food that would last weeks: home-canned vegetables, freshly baked bread, apple butter, smoked ham, pickled beans. The men took turns helping Dad at the lumber mill, knowing he wouldn't have the strength to work alone in those first weeks. Solidarity was the only tangible comfort in those days. But the visits gradually decreased. Life has its own urgency, and people returned to their routines. A week after the burial, we were once again just us. A father devastated by loss, 3 motherless children, and a grandfather whose eyes now followed me around the house like a predator stalking prey. My father, consumed by his own grief, barely noticed what was happening under our roof. He left before dawn and returned after dusk, collapsing exhausted into bed with no energy for anything else. I believe work was his only escape, the only way to bear the absence of my mother. Perhaps he thought if he tired himself enough, he wouldn't dream of her at night. "You're being a good girl, Abby," he would sometimes say, running his hand through my hair. "Your mother would be proud." Those words should have been comforting, but they caused me deep pain. If he knew what happened when he was away, would he still look at me with that pride in his eyes? I took on the household responsibilities as best I could. I woke early to prepare breakfast, helped my siblings dress for the small rural school 2 miles from our house, washed clothes in the stone basin, cooked what I had learned from Mom. My small hands tried to recreate her gestures, but everything came out different. The beans never had the same flavor, the bread didn't rise the same way, the clothes weren't as white. Each failure was a painful reminder of her absence. At night, When everyone was asleep, I cried silently into my pillow, muffling the sobs so as not to wake Grace, who slept beside me. I cried for Mom, for myself, for the weight of responsibilities too heavy for such small shoulders, but mainly I cried because of the terror that grew in my chest every time I was left alone with my grandfather. After that first night, he became more careful, more methodical. He waited for moments when Dad went to town to resolve some business. When my siblings were at school or playing with neighbors, there was always an excuse to call me to his room, to the tool shed, or even to the edge of the creek that crossed our property. "Come help me with this, Abby," he would say in that rough voice that allowed no refusal. And I would go, my body trembling, knowing what awaited me, but unable to flee. What choice did a 10-year-old girl have in an era when children had no voice? When the word of an adult, especially a respected man in the community, was unquestionable law. He always used the same words afterward. "This stays between us. Your father already has enough problems. You don't want to cause him more suffering, do you?" And thus he silenced me, using my love for my father as a weapon against me. It was a cruel manipulation game that I, in my innocence, couldn't fight. I truly believed that telling the truth would kill my father with grief, that it would be my fault if our family, already fragile from losing Mom, completely fell apart. The months dragged on in this continuing nightmare. Winter arrived with full force, bringing frosts that whitened the fields in the morning, and nights so cold we could see our breath inside the house. On the days when the north wind seemed to cut to the bone, I almost appreciated the cold that allowed me to wear multiple layers of clothing, creating one more barrier between my body and the hands that violated me. Over time, I learned to mentally absent myself during those moments. While my body was trapped there, my mind fled far away, to the stories Mom used to tell, to the green meadows where we used to pick blackberries in summer, to a distant future where I would be big enough to run away with my siblings. It was a form of survival, a dissociation that allowed me to endure the unbearable. In August of that year, when I turned 11, I realized with horror that my body was beginning to change. Small, painful buds appeared on my chest, announcing an early puberty that only worsened my situation. My grandfather noticed these changes with an interest that filled me with nausea. "Turning into a young lady, eh?" he commented one day, his eyes scanning my body in a way that made me want to disappear. "Your mother developed early too." I tried to hide the changes as best I could. I wore loose clothing, hunched my shoulders, bound my chest under my shirts, anything to appear smaller, less visible, less desirable in his eyes. But it was useless. That summer we began receiving frequent visits from a distant cousin of my father, Evelyn Thompson, a widowed lady in her 50s, who lived in town. She came on Sundays, bringing candy for us and observing our situation with attentive eyes that seemed to see more than others. "This girl is much too thin," she commented once to my father. "And those eyes look like they belong to someone much older." It was the first time anyone had noticed anything. I felt a mixture of hope and panic. Part of me wanted her to discover everything, to take this heavy secret away from me. Another part trembled with fear at the consequences, the possibility of not being believed, of causing a storm in the family. My grandfather perceived the danger Evelyn represented. He became more cautious when she was around, treating me with a calculated distance that could pass for respect. But his eyes sent clear messages. No one would believe me. I had no choice but to keep quiet. As time passed, I developed small acts of resistance, little rebellions that probably went unnoticed by others, but for me represented important battles in the silent war I was waging. I began sleeping with scissors under my pillow. I started waking up before everyone else to lock the door of the room I shared with Grace. I invented illnesses when I would be left alone with him. But my best weapon was silence. Not the silence of the victim, but that of the observer. I learned to read the signs, to anticipate his movements, to predict his moods. I knew when it would be safer to be near other people, when it was better to hide in the loft of the barn. a hiding place I discovered by chance, and that he never found when his mood was particularly dangerous. In March of 1958, almost a year after my mother's death, something happened that would change the course of our family history forever. It was a Saturday, I remember clearly. Dad had gone to town to sell some produce from our small garden and buy supplies. Sammy and Grace were at a neighbor's house, attending a birthday party. I was alone in the house with my grandfather, cleaning the stove, when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Come here, Abby," he ordered in that tone that allowed no refusal. My heart raced. I knew that tone well, that look. But that day, something inside me rebelled. Maybe it was the wear and tear of almost a year living in that hell. Maybe it was the memory of my mother, which seemed particularly vivid that morning. Maybe it was simply that my cup of tolerance had overflowed. "I can't right now," I replied without looking at him, continuing to scrub the ashes from the stove with more force than necessary. "I need to finish this before Dad gets back." He seemed stunned for a moment. I had never directly disobeyed him before, but the surprise soon gave way to anger. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, grabbed my arm with enough force to leave marks, and began dragging me toward his room. "Who do you think you are to answer me like that?" he growled between clenched teeth. "Have you forgotten who's in charge here while your father is away?" I struggled, trying to break free, scratching, kicking. It was useless against the strength of a grown man, but I kept resisting. Something had broken inside me. If it was going to happen anyway, at least I wouldn't be submissive this time. That's when we heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. My grandfather froze, still holding my arm with brutal force. We weren't expecting anyone at that hour. He abruptly released me, pushing me against the stove. "Go see who it is. And not a word about this, understand?" I ran to the window, my heart pounding. It was Dad's pickup, returning earlier than expected. Never had the faded blue of that old Chevy looked so beautiful to my eyes. My grandfather quickly disappeared to his room, and I tried to compose myself before Dad entered, smoothing my apron, fixing my hair, breathing deeply to contain the tears that threatened to fall. Dad entered, carrying a sack of supplies and a small package wrapped in brown paper that I later discovered was a length of fabric for me to make a new dress. His face, normally marked by sadness since Mom's death, seemed a little lighter that day. "Came back early," he explained, placing the groceries on the table. "Storms brewing, thought it best not to risk getting stuck on the roads." Indeed, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, announcing one of those summer storms that turned dirt roads into impassable mud. I helped put away the groceries, trying to act normally, but my arm throbbed where my grandfather had gripped it, and my heart still beat erratically from the confrontation. Dad watched me carefully as we organized everything. At one point, his hand touched my arm exactly where the red marks left by my grandfather's fingers were. I instinctively recoiled with a whimper of pain I couldn't suppress. "What happened to your arm, Abby?" he asked, frowning. "Nothing," I replied quickly. "I hit it when I was cleaning under the table." He didn't seem convinced. His eyes, so similar to mine, the same ones I'd seen in the mirror aging prematurely, studied my face for a long moment. "Is there something going on that I should know about?" he finally asked, his voice soft but firm. The words got stuck in my throat. It was my chance to tell everything, to end this nightmare. But the fear of disbelief, the consequences, the possibility of destroying what was left of our family paralyzed me. "No, Dad," I lied, lowering my eyes so he wouldn't see the truth in them. "Everything's fine," he sighed, not seeming convinced at all, but didn't insist. Instead, he briefly stroked my hair before going to see where my grandfather was. The first thunderclaps began to sound in the distance, announcing the imminent storm. Inside me, another storm was forming, made of guilt for not having taken this opportunity, relief for having escaped this time, and a new feeling that took me time to recognize. Hope. Dad had noticed something, had asked questions. Maybe, just maybe, Not everything was lost. What I didn't know at that moment was that the real storm in our family was just beginning to form on the horizon, about to break with a force that would change our lives forever. The storm that was forming that March afternoon of 1958 wasn't just the one darkening the horizon. There was another, denser and more charged, forming within the walls of our house. The days following the incident in the kitchen were filled with almost palpable tension. My grandfather, for the first time, seemed cautious around me, giving me looks that mixed threat and weariness. My father, meanwhile, watched us with renewed attention, as if he had awakened from a long trance of mourning. Something had changed in my father's behavior. He started coming home earlier from the mill, asking questions about our day, noticing small details that before went unnoticed in his fog of grief. Sometimes I'd find him watching me with a questioning expression, as if trying to decipher a puzzle written on my face. Other times, I'd catch him in whispered arguments with my grandfather, conversations that abruptly ceased when I entered the room. The household routine continued its apparent course. I kept caring for the home and my siblings, cooking, washing, mending. But something subtle had changed in the family dynamic. The opportunities my grandfather found to be alone with me drastically decreased, not for lack of attempts on his part, but because Dad seemed to always be nearby at critical moments, appearing unexpectedly when least expected. On a particularly chilly April evening, when fall was already painting the maple trees red and gold, what I secretly feared and hoped for occurred. My siblings were already asleep, and I was finishing washing the dinner dishes. The kitchen was dimly lit by the kerosene lamp hanging in the center, and by the orange glow escaping through the stove door. The sound of crickets and the distant howling of a dog were the only noises, besides the monotonous rubbing of the cloth against the plates. My grandfather entered the kitchen stealthily, with that heavy, yet silent walk that I had learned to recognize and fear. Dad had gone out to check on a noise in the barn where we kept the tools, or at least that's what he said. In retrospect, I realize it was a carefully planned trap. All alone, Abby? My grandfather's voice sounded low and hoarse behind me. The familiar shiver of dread ran down my spine. I nodded without turning around, my hands mechanically continuing the work of drying the dishes, as if nothing was happening, as if I could hide in the normalcy of the task. It's been a while since we've had a moment to ourselves, he continued, coming closer. I could feel his breath, a mixture of bourbon and pipe tobacco, on my neck. Your father's been sticking pretty close lately, hasn't he? His heavy hands rested on my small shoulders, and I felt my legs weaken. I already knew what would come next, the same nightmare that had been repeating for almost a year. I closed my eyes tightly, seeking that distant place in my mind, where I used to take refuge. What's going on here? My father's voice, sharper than I'd ever heard it, broke the silence. I opened my eyes to see him standing in the kitchen doorway, an expression mixing disbelief and growing fury on his normally gentle face. My grandfather removed his hands from my shoulders as if they had been burned, taking a step back. Nothing, son, he replied with false casualness. Just talking with the girl. Talking? My father's voice was low, contained, but his eyes burned. That's not what it looked like to me. A dense silence descended over the kitchen, broken only by the crackling of the wood in the stove. I remained frozen, the half-dried plate still in my hands, unable to move or speak. I had imagined this moment, the moment when my secret would be revealed, hundreds of times, but now that it was happening, I couldn't utter a single sound. Go to your room, Abby, Dad ordered without taking his eyes off my grandfather. I hesitated for an instant, torn between the relief of being able to escape and the fear of what would happen when I left. Go, he repeated, this time more firmly. I put down the plate and cloth and quickly passed by my father toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. But instead of going to my room, I stopped in the darkness of the hallway, my heart pounding so hard I feared they could hear it. What were you doing with my daughter? My father's voice sounded again, now that he thought I was far away. I told you, we were just talking, my grandfather replied, but his voice had a subtle tremor I had never heard before. Are you imagining things? Am I? My father's voice took on a dangerous tone. I've been watching you two for weeks. The marks on her arms, the way she flinches when you come near, the nightmares at night. Do you think I'm blind or stupid? She's a clumsy girl, always hurting herself. And as for the nightmares, she lost her mother. It's normal. Don't take me for a fool. My father's voice exploded, making me shrink in the darkness of the hallway. Last night I stayed awake, pretending to sleep. I saw you trying to enter her room. I saw you insisting even after she said she was sick. A stunned silence followed those words. So Dad had seen, had noticed. He wasn't as oblivious as I thought. A wave of relief washed over me, immediately followed by terror at what would come next. You don't understand? My grandfather's voice sounded conciliatory. The girl confuses things. She needs a mother figure. And since she doesn't have one, sometimes she misinterprets. Shut up! Dad shouted, and I heard the sound of something breaking. A plate perhaps, or a cup. Don't you dare suggest my daughter is lying? I didn't do anything she didn't want. My grandfather's voice took on a more defiant tone. She's been flirting with me for months, offering herself. She's a woman before her time, just like her mother. The sound that followed was like thunder inside the kitchen, the impact of a fist against flesh. I heard a grunt of pain and the noise of furniture being dragged, objects falling. They were fighting. Never speak about my wife or daughter like that again, roared my father's voice. The sound of the fight increased. I covered my ears, terrified, but couldn't block out the noise. Glass breaking, wood creaking, grunts of pain and effort. Then, a particularly loud blow followed by a sudden silence. I ran back to the kitchen door, driven by panic. The scene I found will forever be etched in my memory. My father standing, panting with bleeding knuckles. My grandfather fallen on the packed dirt floor, motionless, a blood stain spreading under his head, where it had hit the corner of the cast iron stove. Dad, my voice came out as a whisper. My father turned to me, his face transformed by shock and the realization of what he had just done. For an instant, he seemed not to recognize me, as if looking through me to some distant point. Then his gaze cleared. Abby, he said, his voice broken. I told you to go to your room. Is he? I couldn't complete the question. Dad knelt beside my grandfather, checking for a pulse in his neck. After a long moment, he nodded gravely. Go wake up Sammy, he ordered, adopting a practical tone that contrasted with the chaos around us. Tell him you didn't hear anything, that you were asleep. Understand? No matter what happens, you kids didn't see or hear anything. I nodded, terrified but strangely relieved. My grandfather was dead. The nightmare had ended, but another, different one was just beginning. And Abby, Dad added, holding my shoulders and looking me directly in the eyes. Someday, when you're older, I'm going to ask you what really happened in this house. And on that day, I want you to tell me everything, but not today. Today, you didn't see anything, understand? I promise, Dad, I answered with a maturity beyond my years. The following hours were a confused blur. I remember waking Sammy, whispering the official version, that we hadn't heard anything, that we were asleep. I remember returning to my room and hugging Grace, who by divine grace, slept soundly through all the chaos. I remember the sound of horse and voices in the middle of the night, of lanterns passing through the window slats, of men entering and leaving our house, of the sheriff, a burly man with a thick mustache, asking questions in a low voice, of the town doctor examining my grandfather's body right there in the kitchen, before they took him away. It was an accident, Rick, I heard the sheriff say to my father. Anyone can see the old man slipped and hit his head. Could have happened to anyone, especially after a few glasses of bourbon. Perhaps the sheriff truly believed that, or perhaps he simply didn't want to get involved in troubles between father and son in a small community where everyone knew each other. Either way, the official version was established, Henry Miller, 69, had stumbled while drunk, hit his head on the corner of the stove, and died instantly. A sad domestic accident. No one questioned, no one suspected. Or if they did, they preferred to keep silent, respecting the grief of a family already marked by the recent tragedy of losing my mother. The wake was brief and sparsely attended. A few townspeople, some of my grandfather's old work companions. No genuine tears were shed. My father remained stoic, fulfilling the social obligations with the dignity of a man doing what he must, not what he desires. I observed everything with a curious detachment, as if attending a play in which I had no part. When the simple casket was lowered into the ground in the small community cemetery, I felt an enormous weight leave my shoulders, as if along with that body they were burying the last months of terror I had lived through. The night after the burial, when we finally returned home and my siblings were asleep, Dad called me to the kitchen table, the same place where days earlier the tragedy had occurred. The floor had been scrubbed until no trace of blood remained, but we both knew what had happened there. "Abby," he began in a low voice so as not to wake the children, "I never asked you directly, and I'm not going to ask you now. I don't want you to carry that burden." His eyes, so similar to mine, were moistened with restrained tears, the first genuine display of emotion I had seen in him since the incident. "I just want you to know that if I did what I did, it was because a father protects his children. Always, no matter against whom or against what." He extended his hand across the table and took mine. It was the first time we had truly talked since my mother's death. "Someday, when you're ready, if you want to talk about this, I'll be here, but if you prefer to never bring up the subject, that's fine too. What matters is that we're safe now," I replied, surprising him and myself with the firmness in my voice. "We both did what had to be done, and we're alive. That's what matters." He looked at me with a mixture of surprise and admiration, as if truly seeing me for the first time. "You're strong, like your mother," he finally said, a small, sad smile appearing on his tired face. "She would be proud." In that moment, sitting at the kitchen table under the dim light of the lamp, something new formed between us, a silent pact, a mutual understanding that transcended words, and for the first time in almost a year, I slept without fear, without nightmares, without the shadow of the monster living under the same roof. What I didn't know then was that some secrets, even when deeply buried, have ways of resurfacing years later, transformed by time but no less powerful, and that although that dark chapter had come to an end, there was still a long road of healing ahead, a road that would take decades and test me in ways I could never have foreseen on that night of relative relief and newfound peace. Life has a strange way of moving forward, even when it seems impossible. After my grandfather's burial, our house gradually ceased to be a place of fear and became a home again. Not immediately or completely, certain shadows persist for a long time, clinging to walls like stains no soap can remove. The summer of 1958 arrived with typical intensity, bringing scorching days that cracked the dry earth and stifling nights that made sleep nearly impossible. Yet despite the relentless heat, something inside me began to slowly thaw, as if an inner winter was finally giving way to a hesitant spring. My father, although we never again directly discussed what happened that fateful night, began to rebuild our family with a silent determination that I admire to this day. He took on not only the role of provider, but also tried, in his awkward way as a countryman, to fill the void left by my mother. His calloused hands, accustomed to the rough work at the lumber mill, now attempted delicate gestures, braiding Grace's hair in the morning, checking Sammy's homework after school, sometimes even making simple Sunday biscuits following the yellowed recipe my mother kept in the cookie tin. "Your dad's turning into a regular housewife," neighbors would joke when they discovered he had learned to make cornbread or mend clothes. He just smiled without embarrassment. "My children need it, so I learn," he would respond simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Though in rural Kentucky in 1958, it was almost revolutionary for a widower to take on such tasks. As for me, Although I continued helping with household chores, Dad insisted I return to school. "Your mother wanted you to study?" he would say whenever I tried to argue that I would be more useful at home. And so do I. Returning to the rural school, a single room, where students of various ages studied together under the guidance of Miss Bradley, was both a relief and a new kind of challenge. Relief to be away from home for a few hours, among people who didn't know, who would never know what had happened between those adobe walls. Challenge, because at 11 years old, I carried experiences that irrevocably separated me from the other children. "Abby lives in her own world," Miss Bradley would comment during meetings with my father. "She has potential, learns quickly, but always seems distant, as if part of her is somewhere else." She was right, of course. Part of me was always on guard, always vigilant. The trauma had taught me never to completely lower my guard, to always look for escape routes, to distrust easy smiles and unexplained kindnesses. At night, the nightmares continued, though less frequently. I would wake up screaming, my body covered in cold sweat, terrible images still vivid behind my eyelids. In the worst moments, it was my father who would come, sit on the edge of the bed, and patiently wait until my breathing normalized. "It's all right, Abby," he would whisper in the darkness. "Just a bad dream. No one's going to hurt you ever again." He never asked what I dreamed about. It wasn't necessary. We both knew. In early 1960, when I was 13, life dealt us another card. Evelyn Thompson, that distant cousin of my father who occasionally visited us, was widowed from her second husband, childless and alone in her large house in Louisville. She proposed something that would once again change the course of our lives. "Richard," she said one Sunday after dinner, as we drank hot chocolate on the porch, "I've thought about this a lot. Why don't you come live with me in Louisville? The house is too big for me alone, and the children would have access to better schools." Dad hesitated, running a hand over his poorly shaven chin. "I don't know, Evelyn. This land is all I have. It was my father's, and his father's before that." "Nobody's talking about selling it," she responded pragmatically. "Hire someone to look after it. Come on weekends. Think of the children, Richard. What future do they have here? Abby's almost a young lady now. She needs a proper education if she doesn't want to end up as a maid in someone's house." That touched my father deeply. If there was anything he ardently desired, it was for his children to have opportunities that he and my mother never had. The decision wasn't made that day, but the seed was planted. In the months that followed, the idea grew, was discussed countless times at the dinner table, weighing advantages and disadvantages. Sammy and Grace were excited at the prospect of living in the big city, which was really just a larger town of about 40,000 inhabitants. I had mixed feelings. On one hand, the idea of leaving that house where so much suffering had occurred was tempting. On the other, despite everything, it was the only home I had known. Every corner, every tree in the yard, every stone on the path to the creek contained memories. Some painful, yes, but others precious, from happier times when Mom was still alive. In July 1960, in the midst of a sweltering summer, we made the move. We didn't take much: some clothes, personal items, family photographs, the set of dishes that had been my mother's. The rest stayed behind, along with a part of ourselves. Evelyn's house in Louisville was truly large by our standards. A Victorian 2-story with 4 bedrooms, a separate living and dining room, a spacious kitchen with both a wood stove and a gas one, a modern convenience that greatly impressed us, and even an indoor bathroom with running water, a luxury we had never experienced. "Each child will have their own room," Evelyn announced, to the delight of Sammy and Grace, who had always shared cramped spaces. Adapting to the new life wasn't easy. My father, accustomed to physical work at the lumber mill, now had a job at a hardware store, attending the counter, making deliveries. His hands, once calloused by the saw, now handled ledgers and calculated accounts. In the first weeks, he would come home with a lost look, as if not exactly sure who he was in this new reality. As for me, I was enrolled in St. Agnes Catholic School, run by nuns. It was a completely different environment from the rural schoolhouse. Classrooms separated by grade, several teachers, specific subjects, impeccable uniforms, strict rules. On the first day, looking at those dozens of girls with their pleated skirts and starched white blouses, I felt a fear I hadn't experienced since the dark times in our old house. "You'll get used to it," Evelyn assured me, adjusting my navy blue tie for the third time. "It's one of the best schools in the region. A diploma from here opens doors." I said nothing, but doubted I would ever get used to belonging to that world. The other girls came from established families in the city, daughters of merchants, pharmacists, notaries, even the mayor. I was the country girl with a marked accent and rustic manners, wearing a second-hand uniform that Evelyn had obtained from an acquaintance. The first months were a time of almost total isolation. I always sat at the back of the classroom, only spoke when the nuns directly questioned me, avoided recess by staying in the library with the pretext of studying. It wasn't just shyness, it was a protective barrier I had erected around myself, an invisible wall that kept the world at a safe distance. Academically, however, I flourished. I discovered in books a refuge, an alternative world where I could escape from the complications of reality. Sister Ruth, my English teacher, was the first to notice my talent for writing and reading. "You have a gift," she told me one afternoon after reading an essay I had written about the place I came from. I had described the rolling fields of our property, the clear water creek, the wild lilies that exploded into color at the end of spring, with a vividness that surprised her. "You should consider becoming a teacher someday." It was the first time anyone had suggested I could be more than a housewife, more than a continuation of my mother's fate. The idea planted itself like a fragile seed in poorly fertile ground, but which, against all odds, began to germinate. At home, our new family dynamic also found its own rhythm. Evelyn, though energetic and sometimes excessively practical, had a generous heart. She treated us as if we were her own children, with a peculiar mixture of discipline and affection that, to my surprise, worked well. "A girl your age needs to learn more than just studying," she would say, teaching me to crochet on winter nights. "You need to know how to manage a house, sew a button, make a cake that doesn't look like a brick, but you also need to know mathematics so you won't be cheated in accounts. And read good books to have your own topics and opinions," she would add. It was a vision of femininity that stood halfway between the traditional and the progressive. For the time, especially in Kentucky in the early 60s. Evelyn wasn't revolutionary, didn't openly advocate for women to have careers instead of families. But she firmly believed that an educated woman made better decisions in life. My father, for his part, seemed to slowly rejuvenate. The weight he carried on his shoulders since my mother's death, aggravated by the incident with my grandfather, began to diminish. He started to smile more, to tell stories during dinner, to play with Grace and help Sammy with his studies. Occasionally, on Saturday nights, he would even go to the movies with some colleagues from the store, a socialization he never would have considered in our previous life. It was on one of those Saturday nights, when I was 15, that Evelyn and I had the conversation that would change my understanding of what had happened in our old house. We were alone at home. Dad had gone out with Sammy to see a movie at the local theater. Grace was at a birthday party for a school friend. Evelyn was crocheting while I read a book that Sister Ruth had lent me. "Abby," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had established itself between us. "There's something I've wanted to ask you for a long time." I looked up from the book, noting the unusual seriousness in her tone. "What is it, Aunt Evelyn?" She set the crochet aside and looked at me directly. "What really happened with your grandfather?" The question hit me like a bucket of cold water. In all those years, no one, absolutely no one, had asked that directly. It was a silently forbidden subject, a ghost that floated in our family but was never named. I hesitated, feeling my throat suddenly dry, slipped and hit his head on the stove. It was an accident, Aunt Evelyn. Evelyn continued looking at me, her penetrating eyes as if they could read through my rehearsed words. Abby, she finally said, her voice softer. I'm asking because I need to know if I'm right about what I've suspected for so long. I'm not judging anyone. I just want to understand. Understand what? I asked defensively, though I knew exactly what she was talking about. I began to suspect when I visited you, she continued, ignoring my question. I saw how you shrank when he came near, how your eyes, so much like your mother's, had lost that childlike light. It wasn't just mourning, it was something else, something I recognized because, she paused, taking a deep breath, because I went through something similar when I was your age. That unexpected confession broke something inside me. Tears that I had held back for years began to silently roll down my face. No one was gonna believe me, I finally whispered. He was respected. I was just a little girl. I would have believed you, she replied simply. That's why I became so close to your family after your mother passed. I saw the signs, but I wasn't certain. I couldn't intervene without proof. And then Dad discovered it, I completed, the words now flowing like a torrent that couldn't be contained. He saw Grandpa, trying to, and they fought, and Grandpa fell. I couldn't finish. Evelyn rose from her armchair and came to sit beside me on the sofa, enveloping me in an embrace that was both protective and understanding. For the first time since it all happened, I allowed myself to truly cry, not the silent sobs into the pillow at night, but an open, visceral crying that shook my entire body. Your father did what he had to do, she said when I finally calmed down. Any father worth his salt would have done the same. How did you know? I asked, wiping my tears with the back of my hands. How are you sure? When you've lived long enough, certain things become evident, she responded enigmatically. Then, with a sigh, she added, and your father told me shortly after you moved here. He needed to unburden himself to someone. And he decided to trust me. I remained silent, absorbing this information. So my father had spoken about the matter, just not with me. Why are you telling me this now? I finally asked. Evelyn took my hands in hers, her eyes meeting mine with an unusual intensity. Because you've carried this weight for too long, Abby. You've carried it in silence, believing you had to protect your father, your siblings, even me. But secrets like this sicken the soul, consume the person from within, like rust on iron. Believe me, I know. She paused, as if deciding how far she should go. What happened in that house wasn't your fault, nor was it your father's fault. The only person to blame has already paid for what he did, and now it's time for you to start freeing yourself from that weight, so you can truly live. That conversation, though painful, was the first true step on my path to healing. It wasn't magical or instant. The scars didn't disappear overnight, but something fundamental changed. I was no longer alone with my secret. There was someone who knew, who understood, who didn't judge me for the part I believed I had played in that nightmare. In the years that followed, I gradually found my voice. With Evelyn's guidance and my father's silent but constant support, I began to rebuild myself, not as a victim, but as a survivor. Each nightmare faced, each memory processed, each new day fully lived was a victory against the past that tried to define me. Scars remained, of course, some visible only to me, others that affected relationships, choices, fears. But scars are also marks of healing. Silent testimonies of battles won against adversities that could have destroyed us, but didn't succeed. And it was thus between pains and healings, falls and risings, that I reached adulthood. Not intact, not perfect, but whole, and finally, mistress of my own destiny. The years unfolded like pages in an old book, some chapters smoother, others rougher, but all composing the story that brought me here, to my 82 years, sitting on this wooden porch swing in the same Kentucky that saw me born. Time has whitened my hair, marked my face with wrinkles that tell stories without words, slightly curved my back, but it hasn't managed to bend my spirit, not after all I've faced. I became an elementary school teacher in 1965, at 18 years old. My first job was in a rural school, not much different from the one where I began my own studies. The single classroom, desks worn by use, students of varying ages, it all brought me bittersweet memories of my own childhood. But now I was on the other side, in the position of one who guides, who protects. It was that same year when my father remarried, to Evelyn, who had been our safe harbor in the most difficult times. It was no surprise to anyone. The two had developed a silent partnership over the years, a companionship that eventually blossomed into something deeper. Sammy, then 16 and Grace, 13, accepted the development naturally. For them, Evelyn had already been practically a mother for years. I remember the simple wedding at the main church in Louisville. My father, at 45, seemed as nervous as a teenager, constantly adjusting the borrowed suit that didn't quite fit his broad worker's shoulders. Evelyn, in a light blue dress, modest, with a small arrangement of flowers in her graying hair, radiated a contained happiness appropriate for a widow of her age. "You're happy with this, aren't you, Abby?" my father asked me on the eve of the ceremony, when we found ourselves alone on the porch of the house. "Of course I am, Dad," I replied with sincerity. "You both deserve this chance?" He nodded, relieved, and then said something that would forever be etched in my memory. "You know, there are days when I still wake up thinking of your mother. I think a part of me will always love her." He paused, his eyes getting lost on the horizon where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky red and gold. But I learned that a person's heart can expand, can love again without betraying what it once felt. He made another pause, longer. "I think it's the same with pain, Abby. It doesn't completely disappear, but we can learn to carry it without it destroying us." It was the closest conversation we had about all that had happened years ago. Neither he nor I directly mentioned the events of that fateful night, but it wasn't necessary. There was an understanding between us that transcended words. The following year, I met Joseph Johnson. Everyone called him Joe. He was the new doctor in the neighborhood, recently graduated from the University of Kentucky, idealistic and full of plans to improve health in underserved communities. Our first meeting was at the school where I taught. He had come to vaccinate the children against polio, part of a national campaign. "The teacher needs to take the vaccine too," he joked, seeing me organizing the children in line. "I've had all the necessary vaccines, doctor," I replied with a formality that was part of my armor against the world. "But thank you for your concern." In the months that followed, Joe appeared with increasingly greater frequency at the school, always with some plausible medical excuse, checking the students' vision, distributing information about dental hygiene, giving talks on parasite prevention, but his eyes invariably sought me out in the classroom, and his visits always extended with conversations after the school day ended. Resisting him was my first instinctive reaction. The trauma of my adolescence had raised walls around my heart, making me cautious about any male approach. The few friends I made over the years frequently teased me about my prolonged singlehood, not really understanding the abyss of distrust that existed within me. "You can't spend your entire life alone, Abby," my colleague Ellen, the science teacher, would say as we graded exams together. "Dr. Johnson is a good catch, and he's clearly interested." "I'm fine as I am," I would automatically respond. "I have my students, my family, my books. Not every woman needs a husband to feel complete." It was true, in part. I had built a meaningful life without depending on a romantic relationship. But there was also the fear, the deep and irrational fear that any intimacy might awaken the dormant demons of my past. It was Evelyn who, with her practical wisdom, finally opened a breach in my defenses. "I understand your fear, Abby," she told me one Sunday afternoon as we prepared dinner. "But not all men are like your grandfather. Your own father is proof of that. And if you keep running from the possibility of loving, You'll be allowing that man to continue controlling your life, even after he's dead. Her words hit me with the force of a revelation. I was, indeed, letting my grandfather's ghost dictate my limits, my possibilities. It was an insidious form of self-imposed prison. In the summer of 1967, I allowed Joe to take me to dinner in downtown Louisville. I was so nervous I could barely eat the fried chicken he ordered as a starter. Relax, he smiled, noticing my discomfort. It's just dinner, I'm not asking you to marry me, yet. That yet should have frightened me, but strangely, it made me smile. There was something in Joe's direct honesty that disarmed my defenses. Our courtship progressed slowly, with an almost reverential care on his part. He seemed to intuit, without me needing to explain, that there were wounds in me that needed time to completely heal. He never pressured me for physical intimacy beyond what I was comfortable with, never questioned my occasionally inexplicable retreats. On a starry night, sitting by the Ohio River, I made the most difficult and liberating decision of my life. I told him everything. About my mother, about my grandfather, about the night my father inadvertently became a killer to protect me. I spoke without looking at him directly, my eyes fixed on the dark waters reflecting the starry sky. When I finished, there was a long silence. I feared I had made an irreparable mistake, destroyed any possibility of a future with him. I finally gathered the courage to look at him. Silent tears were running down his face. Abby, he finally said, his voice broken with emotion. Thank you for trusting me enough to share this. I can't imagine the courage it must have taken, not only to survive that, but to become the extraordinary person you are today. He took my hands in his, in a gesture that was both protective and respectful. Nothing you've told me changes what I feel for you. If anything has changed, it's my admiration, which has only increased. We married in 1968, in a simple ceremony at the same church where my father and Evelyn had sealed their union years before. It was an old-fashioned country wedding, with a reception in the church hall, food prepared by the women of the community, music played by a local band. The first years of our marriage were ones of mutual adaptation. Despite my conscious decision to trust Joe, my body held memories that my rational mind couldn't always control. There were nights when I would wake up screaming, moments of panic apparently without cause, disproportionate reactions to innocent gestures. Joe, with the patience of one who truly loves, was by my side in each relapse, in each progress. We're in no hurry, he would often say. We have our whole lives ahead of us. In 1970, our first child was born, a healthy boy we named William, though everyone called him Will, in honor of Joe's father. The birth was difficult, complicated by traumatic memories that transformed the physical experience into a psychological trial. But when they placed that small bundle in my arms, something profound transformed within me. I'll protect you, I whispered to the baby who looked at me with wide-open eyes, so similar to mine. Nothing and no one will hurt you while I'm alive. It was a promise that echoed the one my own father had made to me, albeit belatedly. One circle was closing while another was opening. 2 years later, our family was completed with the birth of Olivia, a little girl with dark hair and an easy smile, who from the beginning showed the determination that would be her trademark in life. The decade of the 1970s passed quickly, among diapers, first steps, first words, occasional trips to Lexington to visit Joe's parents, sleepless nights with feverish children, everyday joys that gradually healed old wounds. I continued teaching, eventually assuming the position of principal at the same school where I began my career. I found a special purpose in working with vulnerable girls and boys, those who, like me in my time, carried invisible burdens that no one else perceived. I couldn't save them all, but I could create a safe space for them, a refuge where they knew someone believed in them, that someone truly saw them. In 1980, at 33 years old, I faced another significant loss. My father died of a massive heart attack while working in the small garden he maintained behind the house in Louisville. He was found by Evelyn, fallen among the tomato plants he cultivated with such care. He was only 60 years old. The burial was a surreal experience. The same cemetery where we had buried my grandfather years before now received my father. Two men as different as day and night, united only by the blood they shared, but not by values or character. As I watched the casket, a storm was forming on the horizon, large black clouds advancing rapidly, bringing with them strong winds and the first heavy drops of rain. It was as if the sky itself was paying tribute to that simple man who had done what he had to do to protect his daughter, afterward carrying the weight of that act for the rest of his life, without ever complaining. "Even the weather came to say goodbye," commented Sammy, my brother, now a man of 31, married with 3 children. The rain broke fully when the last handful of dirt covered the casket. We didn't run for shelter, as many of the attendees did. We remained there. Sammy, Grace, Evelyn, Joe, our small children and I, letting the water wash away our tears in an involuntary baptism that seemed appropriate for the moment. It was in that instant, soaked to the bone, but strangely at peace, that I realized how fundamental my faith had been in my journey. Not a dogmatic or ritualistic faith, but that deep confidence that even in the most devastating storms of life, there exists a greater purpose that we don't always immediately understand. That faith didn't come from a dramatic epiphany or a sudden conversion. It built slowly through the small and large trials I faced. It grew in the nights when I, still a traumatized child, would look at the stars and feel a loving presence that transcended my understanding. It strengthened when, against all odds, I found in Joe, not just a husband, but a partner who helped me rebuild the trust I thought I had lost forever. God writes straight with crooked lines, Evelyn would often say, and although I didn't fully understand that statement in my youth, over time it gained a profound meaning for me. How else to explain that an abused, traumatized, almost destroyed little girl could not only survive, but flourish? How to justify that, despite everything, I had found love, formed a family, built a meaningful career? How to understand that the same hands that were wounded could now heal, teach, create? Throughout the years that followed, that faith sustained me through other trials. It was with me when Will suffered a serious accident at 15 that almost left him paralyzed. It persisted when Olivia, at 20, announced she was pregnant and the boyfriend had disappeared upon hearing the news. It didn't abandon me even when in 1995, Joe was diagnosed with aggressive cancer that would take him in less than a year. In the 6 months that I cared for him at home, watching that strong man waste away day by day, I questioned many times the why of such suffering. Why did someone so good have to leave so early, at 55? Why, after all I had already faced, did I need to go through this trial more? I found no easy answers. Perhaps there aren't any, but I discovered that faith isn't having all the answers. It's trusting even when the questions remain open. The night Joe passed away, I was alone with him in the room. Our children had gone to find the priest, attending to their father's last request. I held his hand, already cold and weak, as he struggled for each difficult breath. "Don't be afraid," I whispered, repeating the same words he had so often said to me on nights when nightmares tormented me. "I'm here with you." His eyes, clouded by morphine but still lucid, found mine. With a visible effort, he managed to articulate his last words. "You are the strongest person I have ever known." He departed serenely, as he had lived. And although the pain was almost unbearable, I also felt a strange peace, the certainty that our love didn't end there, that there was something beyond this life that we cannot fully comprehend. The years that followed were once again of rebuilding. I retired from teaching but remained active in the community, working especially with women and children in vulnerable situations, perhaps because I knew better than many how important it is to have someone who believes in you when the entire world seems to be falling apart. I had the joy of seeing my children grow and form their own families. Will followed in his father's footsteps in medicine, specializing in pediatrics. Olivia, after raising her daughter Emma on her own, named after my mother's middle name, graduated in law, and today works defending victims of domestic violence and abuse, a choice that didn't surprise me, knowing our family history. I see my life as a complex tapestry of joys and sorrows, of falls and risings. I see a frightened girl who became a strong woman, not despite what she suffered, but in part because of it. Because each trial overcome, each storm weathered, taught me something about resilience, about forgiveness, about the human capacity to begin anew. If I could speak to that 10-year-old girl who lost everything in a single day, I would tell her that the road will be difficult, but that she has within her a strength she doesn't yet know. I would tell her that the scars will never completely disappear, but that they can become marks of honor, testimonies of battles won. I would tell her above all that she is not alone, that there are good people in this world, willing to lend a hand when we need it most, and that God never abandons us, even when we don't understand His ways. This is my story. A story of pain, yes, but also of redemption. A story about how faith can sustain us in the most violent storms of life. A story that perhaps can bring hope to someone who, at this very moment, is going through their own valley of shadows, wondering if they will ever see the light again. If you are going through something similar, I want you to know that you are not alone. That wounds that seem impossible to heal today can become part of your strength tomorrow. That you are stronger than you imagine, more loved than you can perceive, and that your story is not yet over. And if my story touched your heart in some way, I ask that you share it with others who might need to hear this message of hope. Give this video a like so more people can know this story, and perhaps find courage for their own battles. Subscribe to the channel to see other true stories of overcoming and faith that we publish daily. And don't forget to join our WhatsApp group through the link in the video description. There we share daily true stories before they're on the channel, as well as words of faith and hope to start the day well. It's a welcoming community where you can find support and friendship, because in the end, that's what saves us. Knowing we're not alone in our struggles, that others have walked through similar valleys and found their way back to the light. May God be with you today and always.